All right. Well, again, welcome everyone. Good morning. Good to see you. I was off for a couple of weeks there with a trip in Malaysia. Um, so a fruitful time of ministry there with church there that we were doing the family or the church retreat. So opportunity to spend time with them. And then as it turns out, be leaving soon for Turkey and then Pakistan. Um, so next month won't be meeting much with me next week. Hope to, but after that, I'll be off for a couple of weeks because of my training there. But then in August, should be able to meet about almost every week then. Um, so just to give you an idea of the schedule. And then I have something different in September and October potentially that I'm working on that I'll share more with you about in the future. So special training, special teaching uh, that I'm trying to set up for you guys. So I'll give you more details if it comes to pass. So I'll let you know more later. But for now, our focus is on narratives and um, just going over. We've so far covered the first few assignments, the first few steps in the process of doing narratives, which is doing the reading and observation of the book, and then looking at the uh, background context of the book, contextual flow, and then now we've been working on the narrative analysis. So this is the special part where we focus on the narrative features in the story. And if you remember, the narrative analysis included looking at four aspects of narratives, doing an analysis of the four key parts of the narrative stories, and that is the setting, the scenes, the characters, and the plot. Um, and so we looked at the setting analysis last time. I think I recorded for you that session. And now I want to take a look at the scene analysis. The scene analysis is really a key part in the process of studying narratives, because in the scene analysis, we are breaking down the narrative into its parts. Just like when we do a block diagram, we take a paragraph, right, and we break it down um, to analyze it. Or in a book, we break the book down into each of the paragraphs, right? And those paragraphs all have a unit of thought. And when we did the contextual flow, we're looking at each unit of thought, each paragraph going through the epistle and seeing how they're connected together. Well, in narratives, uh, you have a couple of things happening. The book as a whole will have several stories that are connected together, but then each story will have within it scenes that present the flow of that story. And so you can think of a scene kind of like similar to a paragraph, in that each scene, the author shows us something that helps guide us to understand the plot of the story, to help us understand the flow of the story. And each scene will have particular events or statements or actions that uh, that the author wants us to see, and then the next scene will have other events or actions or statements and so on. And each of these scenes, when we put them together, show us the various elements of the plot of the story. And from the plot, that's how we find the meaning of the story. So you can think of the scenes as sort of those components, those subunits, those parts of the story that, when linked together, present a plot which provides us with the point of the story. And so we covered this in the class when we were together, but this morning I wanted to take some time, go through, remind us of the scenes, and then we'll look at Genesis 39 to as an example and go through that together, do the scene analysis for Genesis 39. So that's why I asked, hopefully you had an opportunity to read it before class, but we'll take a look at it again. Remember, scenes again, they're like the building blocks of the story. And each scene represents sort of a unit of thought, as I just mentioned. And together they develop the plot of the story. Now, how is a scene identified? How do we know, how do we distinguish each scene within a story? And you can think of it, each scene comes with a change or a new situation. And that situation, uh, uh, which we could define as a series of events or statements that are connected together, that situation has its own time and place and characters. And so whenever there's a change in the setting, either in the time or the place, sometimes the characters, that's probably showing us a change in situation or a new scene. And as we talked about in class, that's not hard and fast rule. That doesn't mean that every time there's a change in scene or in time that it's a new situation. We have to sort of examine some of the details and to determine whether or not it looks like a new situation. We saw a couple of examples of that in class, like when Abraham and Isaac were going from the base of the mountain up to the place of the altar. That was a change in location and a change in time, but it was still the same situation that they were walking along together, having a dialogue with one another. And so that's, even though the time was changing, that probably took them some time to go up the mountain. And even though the location changed from the bottom of the mountain up to where the altar was, still it was the same situation. So you just have to keep that in mind as you consider the new scenes. But generally speaking, if you have a change in time or place, or sometimes if the characters change, you have a new scene, a new situation. Okay? And so with that, we want to understand, okay, how do we identify, how do we do the scene analysis? And the first step, or I guess before we get to that, let me make sure there are any questions about this before we move forward. Any questions or comments yet, what we've covered? Okay. Now, how do we do scene analysis? Well, if you remember, first thing is we need to identify each scene in the story. Just like when we were doing paragraph analysis with epistles, we had to identify each paragraph in the epistle. Here, we need to identify each scene by looking for that change in situation. Which often comes from a change in time or place or characters. So that's the first thing, is figure out the scenes of the story. So you need to, if you remember, when we did the setting analysis, right, the first step, what we did is we read and observed the story. So we read through the story several times, make observations of the story. So we get familiar with the story. And then the next step is the scene analysis, where now we read through the story again and identify each of those scenes in the story. And once we've done that, then we want to look for specific details within each scene. And there were, I think, 6 features that we were looking at, 7 actually. One is identifying the setting of the scene. And that really we can find when we note the changes, the different situations. So identify the setting. Next, who are the key characters in the scene? Okay. Now remember, this is in the scene, not in the story as a whole. The key or main characters of the story as a whole may not be in every scene. Okay, so we're just focusing on the scene and who are the key characters in that scene. And then the third element we look for is the narrator comments. What does the narrator have to say within that particular scene? Then we want to identify, what about the characters? What do they say that seems important in the scene? And then we take that and summarize the scene, basically. I would say this should probably just summarize point or main event of the scene. All right, so that's a summary. And then lastly, it's, oh, sorry, 6 is that. I don't know why that's there. It's a mistake. Then we want to compose the summary of the scene in our own words, the focus of that scene. And then finally, the 6th thing is to add any general comments or observations from the scene. Now, we've already done observations when we read through the story. You know, when we did the setting, we read through the story several times. We made observations there. But here now is as we focus attention on each scene, sometimes as you do that, other things pop out or things you notice that maybe you didn't notice before. And so if anything like that happens, just write that down as well. Any new observations that you have or insights or thoughts from that. Okay. So those are the 6 things we're looking for: the setting, the narrator comments, the important ones, the important dialogue within the characters of the story, the key characters in the scene, a 1-sentence summary of the focus of that scene, and then finally just general observations that come to your mind, if any, from looking at the scene. Okay, so that's the scene analysis. Identify the scenes and then go back and look for go through each scene individually and identify these elements or characteristics. All right. Okay. Well, if there aren't any questions, we're going to dive right into scene analysis and do an example again from Genesis 39. Genesis 39. Okay. So if you've got your Bibles, go ahead and open up to that chapter. Of course, this is the, we started looking at this in the last session when we did setting analysis. Genesis 39, of course, is the chapter with Joseph and Potiphar's wife and prison. So it's near the beginning of the Joseph narrative. Genesis 37 was when the story opened with Joseph and then his brothers being angry with him, selling him into slavery. And then we had Genesis 38, which was sort of this break with focusing on Judah and Tamar. And then we're back to Genesis 39, and now he's in the household of Potiphar, who was the one who purchased him. And so last time, I just want to focus on the setting of the story, the key, the physical and temporal, the basically the where of the story and the when of the story. And this is something you can go back and look at the video that I did regarding the setting to get the details. But basically from that, we found that the story took place in Egypt. Joseph was taken there. He lived in Potiphar's house. So that's where the location of the story, the timing of the story. If you remember that Joseph was 17 years old when he was taken into slavery. Genesis 37:2 tells us that. And then when he was appointed by Pharaoh as ruler, he was 30 years old. He was in jail more than 2 years, right? Because it was 2 years from, if you'll remember, when he was in jail, he was there for a time, and then he was elevated to a high position within the jail, even as a prisoner. He met the cupbearer and the baker, the king's cupbearer and baker. They had those visions. He interpreted them correctly. But then it wasn't until 2 more years when I think it was the cupbearer who told Pharaoh about Joseph, because Pharaoh had a dream. So it's likely Joseph was around 18 to maybe 25 or 26 years old while in Potiphar's house. Okay, so the time period of Genesis 39 takes place basically from when Joseph entered into Potiphar's house until Joseph was put into prison. So probably 18 years to 26 or 27 years old, something like that. All right, so that's basically where we can place this in terms of the time. And again, the location is in the house of Potiphar, his master. All right. And that's what we determined from our study or examination of the setting. Now let's move to the scene analysis. And here we're going to read through the story and identify each scene. So let me do this. Let's go to Genesis 39. And I'm going to ask you guys to assist on this, to reading through the account together. Genesis 39. Let's see, and we're going to read through from 1 to 23. So maybe we'll take 5 verses each. I'll have Nell, if you could start for us and read verses 1 to 5. And then Yancey, if you could read 6 through 10. And Nigel, if you could read 11 to 15. And then Bien, if you could read 16 to 20. And then Jason, 21 to 23. So the last few verses. Okay. So Nell, I think I asked you to go for it. Start us off, verses 1 to 5 here.
Yeah. Verse 1. Now Joseph was brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an Egyptian official of Pharaoh, the captain of the bodyguard, bought him from the Ishmaelites, who had brought him down there. And Yahweh was with Joseph, so he became a successful man. And he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. Verse 3. Now his master saw that Yahweh was with him, and how Yahweh caused all that he did to succeed in his hand. So Joseph found favor in his sight and attended on him, and he appointed him overseer over his house, and all that he owned he gave in his hand. Now it happened that from the time he appointed him overseer in his house and over all that he owned, Yahweh blessed the Egyptian's house on account of Joseph. Thus the blessing of Yahweh was upon all that he owned in the house and in the field.
Great. All right. Verses 6 to 10.
Yeah, verses 6 to 10. So he left everything he owned in Joseph's hand, and with him there he did not concern himself with anything except the food which he ate. Now Joseph was beautiful in form and beautiful in appearance, and it happened after this event that his master's wife set her eyes on Joseph and said, "Lie with me." But he refused and said to his master's wife, "Behold, with me here, my master does not concern himself with anything in the house, and he has given all that he owns into my hand. There is no one greater in this house than I, and he has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do this great evil and sin against God?" So it happened that as she spoke to Joseph day after day, he did not listen to her to lie beside her or be with her.
Verse 11.
Oops, sorry.
It's all right.
Man, got a sensitive. There. Okay.
Verse 11. Now it happened one day that he went into the house to do his work, and none of the men of the household was there inside. Then she seized him by his garment, saying, "Lie with me." And he left his garment in her hand and fled and went outside. Now it happened when she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and had fled outside, Then she called to the men of her household and spoke to them, saying, "See, he has brought in a Hebrew to us to laugh at us. He came in to me to lie with me, and I screamed. Now it happened that when he heard that I raised my voice and screamed, he left his garment beside me and fled and went outside."
Okay. I forgot who I had next. Was it Stephen or Bien, I think. Bien, are you there? How about you, Sonny? Can you read verses 16 to 20 if you're there?
All right, sir.
Thank you.
What verse again, sir?
Verses 16 to 20.
16 to 8 to 20. All
To
right.
20, yeah.
And she placed her garments beside her until the master came home. Then she spoke to him with these words, saying, "The Hebrew slaves whom you brought to us came in to me and laughed at me. And as I raised my voice and screamed, he left his garment beside me and fled outside. Now it happened that when the master heard the word of his wife, which he spoke to him, saying, 'This is what you slaves did to me,' his his anger burned. So Joseph's master took him and put him into the jail, the place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in the jail."
All right. And then Jason, can you finish up?
Okay. But Yahweh was with Joseph and extended loving kindness to him and gave him favor in the sight of the chief jailer. So the chief jailer gave into the hand of Joseph all the prisoners who were in the jail, so that whatever was done there, he was the one who did it. The chief jailer did not supervise anything under Joseph's hand because Yahweh was with him. And whatever he did, Yahweh made to succeed.
Great. Okay. So that's the story from 39. In 40, we get to a new story, and that's when Joseph interacts with the cupbearer and the baker. All right, but 39 is really he's the whole situation with Potiphar's wife, and then he ends up in jail. Okay, so what we want to do first is, again, we would have read through the story several times, and we did the setting analysis, so we should be familiar with the story by this point. But now what we want to do is, after reading it again, is we're supposed to identify each scene in the story. Okay, so I don't know if you guys were looking for that as we were reading through, but does anyone see where perhaps the first scene begins? Obviously, in verse 1, Joseph's brought down to Egypt. So the setting is he's in Egypt at Potiphar's house. But where does the new situation begin? Or where does this first scene end?
Is it in verse 3?
Okay, Master Joseph. Sorry, did someone else have a comment?
In verse 4 at the house. In verse 4, Dr. Tim,
Yeah,
the scene started at the house.
He's in the house. Okay.
How about verse 5?
We'll just guess each verse. Verse 5, time to time he pointed. It seems like to me that really the first 6 verses are sort of an introduction. It's kind of laying out the situation. Because notice it says in verse 7, it happened after these events. Well, what events? I think, whoops, sorry. I think it's just 1 to 6 is sort of describing, giving an overview, an introduction to the story. Okay, because no specific events or dialogue has happened yet. It's kind of just describing, Joseph was in Potiphar's house and he found favor with Potiphar because of Yahweh, and he was made an overseer, and so Potiphar left him in charge of everything, and Joseph was a handsome guy. All right, so it's kind of more general, I think, in describing, setting up the story, because really the action of the story doesn't seem to start until verse 7, where it says it happened after these events. So there's a shift here, and the focus is now on some specific events regarding Potiphar's wife. So I think verses 1 to 6 really just happened over a period of time, and it's just sort of a summary by the author of the, introducing, setting up the story. Okay? Because really we really don't get the action of the story, the dialogue, the events of the story don't really start until verse 7, when it gets into a specific situation that took place when Joseph was there. So that's how I would see this. And this is often the case. If you examine stories in Scripture, usually the author, when he's shifting to a new story, will often take a little time to introduce that story.
Dr. Kim,
Yeah.
is it safe to say that the first 6 verses is not a scene, but it's like an introduction or summary of the situation?
Yeah, I think
So
that's a better way to
we
look at it. More like an introduction. Not really a scene. It's not like where certain things have happened or certain things were said. It's just kind of an overview, sort of a, like when you read a book and it just opens, once upon a time there was a man who lived in, the land of Israel, and he had a wife and 3 sons, and they were farmers. That's kind of just introductory types of remarks. So often stories begin that way, where they're not really giving specifics about events yet or statements. They're just giving an overview to sort of set things up for us. And I think that's what's happening here. So yeah, I don't even call this a scene. I would call it the introduction, honestly.
So we won't
sometimes
include it in the analysis, Dr. Kim.
I do actually, even though it's introduction, because here, notice there's no dialogue, right? It's all from the narrator in this case. So, but I still do the scene analysis for it, because there's a lot of important information being given in this introductory paragraph for the story. So I would see the first scene, or really, it was really an introduction, and I think it is from verses 1 to 6, because in verse 7, notice it happened after these events, and then now we get into a specific situation that took place while Joseph was in the house of Potiphar. Okay. Does that make sense, guys? Do you have any questions, or you see things differently? This is a common feature. I preached through John 4 when I was there on the last trip, and John does the same thing. Verses 1 to 6 are really an overview, an introduction to the story, which begins in verse 7 when the woman Samaria came to draw water. And now we have dialogue, we have action taking place. But the first 6 verses were really just a introducing, setting up the story. And this is pretty common. So I think that's what's happening here in Genesis 39. All right, but any questions about that? So I would see, yeah, verse 7 is now the next scene, really the first scene of the story. So we have the introduction, verses 1 to 6. Then we have in verse 7, we move from, we're still in Potiphar's house, but now we're at a particular time. And if you study the whole story, Joseph here, it's probably been 5 or 6 or 7 years, something like that. Okay. If you look at, if we're studying the whole account from Genesis 37, where we learn he's 17, then he's taken as a slave. He's probably 17, 18 years old when he starts in Potiphar's house. But then he's probably 25, 26, 27 years old when he is taken to jail. So these events from verse 7 all the way through verse 18 take place at the end of his time in Potiphar's house. So he's probably been there 7, 8 years, something like that. So that's another reason I take verses 1 to 6 as kind of an introduction, because he's really these events, or what he's describing in verses 1 to 6, are happening over, a 7, 6, 8 year period of time. Okay. And so now in verse 7, Moses, the author, focuses in on the last, days of, at the end of Joseph's time there and what happened. So where do you think this scene, which begins in verse 7, where does there seem to be a shift to the next scene, a new situation?
Verse 10.
Verse 10. Happened as she spoke to Joseph, he did not listen or lie with her. Now, it happened one day. So I would say maybe verse 10 is sort of summarizing the events of verse 7 to 9, just kind of kept happening. And then verse 11, on one particular day, then the events. So I would probably just start at the next scene at verse 11. Verse 10 seems to be sort of a summary that I would keep connected to, through verse 7. So I would see 7 to 10 as one scene, and then verse 11 beginning the next scene, because now it's focusing in on one particular day, which, by the way, is Joseph's last day in Potiphar's house. And then that scene goes until where do you guys think?
Verse 19.
18.
Okay.
19 is the another.
Well, let's see. Okay, so she called the men of the house, told them what happened, and then it says she placed the garment by her side until the master came home. And then the master comes home. So we could either put 16 there, like waiting for his master to come home, and then when he's home, she talks to him. Or you could put it at 17, when she actually begins the dialogue. So some time has passed and the master shows up and she tells him what happened. I think verse 19 goes with 17 and 18 because it's just the response of the master. You're gonna have to ignore, this is the translators. They put this title in, but I don't think they should have done that, because 19 immediately follows 18, Because 17 and 18, she's telling her husband what happened, at least her story. And then verse 19, the master responds and then puts Joseph in jail. So, yeah, I would break it either at 16 or 17. I'd probably put it at 17 because it's kind of like if you picture the scene, right? She tries to get Joseph to lie with her. He leaves his garment, right? He runs away. And when she had his garment in hand, she called the men of the house. So the scene's still going. She tells the men what's happened, or what her story anyway. And then 16 is almost like then she goes and sits down with the garment beside her. And so that's kind of where the scene darkens. And then 17, the master has arrived and she speaks to him. So some time has passed between verse 16 and 17, and then also a change in characters because now the master is home. So that's why I would probably put it at verse 17, but you could put it at 16. But it seems like 16 sort of is the closing of the previous scene. You know, it's kind of, again, she's sitting down, has the garment in her hand, puts it next to her, and is kind of waiting. So I don't know. You guys have any thoughts about that? None? Okay. Well, then we'll go with verse 17. But let me see. How do the others break it down? Yeah, I guess here, it kind of sounds like the way ESV has it here. She laid up his garment by her until his master came home, and she told him the same story, saying, so here it's almost like they just combined 16 and 17. What does the New American Standard do? Then she spoke, so it does the same thing as legacy. New King James. So she kept the garment with her. Then she spoke to him these words. What about the NIV? She kept his cloak beside her until his master. Then she so. Whoops. So yeah, it looks like could go with that either way. I don't know. Any thoughts, you guys? The more I look at this, the more I'm, kind of going back and forth. Like I said, sometimes, there's sometimes just sort of there's some subjectivity here. It's not always clear and obvious. We're just trying to identify what seems to go together and where does there seem to be a shift into a new situation. And so to me anyway, seems like there's her dialogue with the, Joseph, he runs off, then she tells the men of the house, and then it's like, then she sits down with the garment waiting. So that seems to me sort of like the close of that scene. And then her husband shows up and she immediately like tells him what her side of the story. So that seems to me to sort of be a new scene. So I don't know if I'm talking this one to death, but Anybody have any thoughts? Go with that. All right, then we'll go with that. Let's see, what about the next scene? So if we look at, say, verse 17 as the next scene where she tells her husband comes home and she tells him what her side of the story, where do we see now a shift in the next scene? His master gets angry, takes Joseph, throws him in jail, and Joseph ends up in jail. And then looks like what? Verse 21? Or even middle of verse 20? He's taken to jail. Again, it's kind of same thing here. We could kind of go either way. I would probably end it right at the end of verse 20. Looks like verse 21 is sort of the next scene, or really conclusion in this story, giving an overview of when Joseph is in jail. Almost really setting up the next story so that it's a connection as well. So I'd probably say verse 21, because that's where now this shift and sort of giving a summary and overview of what happened to Joseph, generally describing when he was in prison. And then verse 1 of chapter 40 now gets into a specific event while he is in jail. Does that make sense? So we'll just go with that. It's kind of like, you remember when we do the paragraph summaries and you sort of go through and you summarize each paragraph, and maybe you start with the paragraphs defined by the translation. And then as you're doing it, sometimes you realize, I think this paragraph actually ends here and the next one starts here. And so there is some subjectivity to trying to identify where each paragraph begins and ends. And we encounter the same kind of thing when we do this scene analysis, as we're trying to identify the various scenes where it's not always obvious. I think when we did the story with Abraham and Isaac, it was a little more, I think, obvious. And especially when we did the example from John 1, if you guys remember in class, that was really obvious, the scene, because it said the next day, the next day, the next day. So that was pretty clear for most of that story. But like here, sometimes the author sort of seems to almost blend a little bit. So you have to really think about, as you're reading it, where would it seem like the lights fade a little bit before the next situation opens up? And that's what it seems like to me in looking at those particular breakdowns. So this is what I had for let's see, where are we? This is what I had for the different scene. Here we go. Yeah, here we are. So like Stephen said, it introduction in verses 1 to 6, and then I would put maybe do it like this. 7 to 10 was the first scene. Joseph's in Potiphar's house, and he's around maybe 25, 26 years old. Verses 11 to 15, it's sometime after scene 1. And then verses 70 to 20, later in the day of scene 2, because now Potiphar comes home. And then scene 4 really is at the jail in Egypt and seems to cover a wider period of time. So really, scene 4 we could almost call a conclusion or even an introduction to the next story in some ways. All right, so this is how I would break this particular account down. So the main events of the story really take place, the dialogue and the action takes place in these middle 3 scenes. And then we sort of have it sandwiched by an introduction that sets up his time in Potiphar's house, how God's with him. And so it seems to cover a period of time. Then we have particular events which lead to Joseph being kicked out of Potiphar's house. And then we have sort of these concluding remarks that talk about probably cover a period of time as he is in jail before the specific events of the cupbearer and the baker, which happen a little later. So also too, guys, by the way, this really shows, again, what we've discussed in class, where the author is just picking certain events from Joseph's life. You know, he doesn't tell us everything that happened, you know, like in Potiphar's house. I'm sure a lot of things happened over those 5 or 6 or 7 years, but he just summarizes them all into, you know, Joseph found favor with Potiphar, and so he was placed in charge. But Moses doesn't go into any details about events that happened. He just zeroes in, focuses in on the specific issue with Potiphar's wife, because that is what then led him to be taken out of Potiphar's house and put into the jail. Right? And then it's in the jail, he just describes certain events which led to eventually his release. Okay, but it didn't cover everything that happened in Joseph's life. Rather, it was focused only on specific things, because again, remember, the author of the story is only going to give us certain events that took place that connect to the message, the point of his story. And that's why when we're looking at Potiphar's wife and that whole circumstance, we need to be careful not to just make it into a moral account of, you know, how to avoid sexual temptation or sexual sin. Certainly Joseph is an example of that, but is that what Moses put the story there for? Is that why this story is here? It could be, but you have to step back and see, okay, well, how does this story tie into the stories around it and the theme of the whole the narrative as a whole? And I think we would see from that, it's actually not, you know, Moses was not, his main point was not to show us, you know, how to avoid or flee temptation, but really, I think he was focusing on what were the events that led to Joseph, you know, getting Joseph from the pit to the throne, right? From being thrown into the pit by his brothers. How did he go from there, right, which his brothers meant for evil? How does he end up from going from that pit all the way to second in command under Pharaoh and to be used to deliver his family from the famine? What are the events that take him there? What does God do in his life to bring him to that point? Because again, remember, the overarching theme of the Joseph narrative is God's sovereign hand in Joseph's life to use him to preserve Jacob's family and thus fulfill his promise of the covenant Abrahamic covenant. And so I think we have to see each story in the Joseph narrative connected to that in some way. All right. You guys following me on that? Does that make sense? You have any thoughts or questions about that?
Morning again, Pastor Tim.
Hi,
You
Nigel.
mentioned earlier the paragraph divisions of the specific translations. Are
Yeah.
these the translations' way of dividing the scenes, at least for narratives?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, if we look at, they indicate, like the Legacy Bible indicates each paragraph of the story by a bold font. You can see it there. Verse 19 is in bold. Verse I don't know why they do this. Verse 11 is in bold. Verse 7. The ESV breaks it down by paragraph. So the middle of verse 6, you notice they have a new paragraph. See that indent here? Verse 11, they have an indent. So that's a new paragraph. So I think that's their way of identifying the scenes. So that's one thing you could do. Verses 1 to 6. So if we look at the ESV, verses 1 to 6 is one paragraph, one scene. The middle of verse 6 through verse 10 is the next scene, which is what we had. Then it has verse 11 to 18, which is kind of odd because verse 19 is still, then he has 19 to 22, but verse 19, it's still the dialogue that she's having with the Potiphar. So that's kind of an odd place to break it, verse 18. The New King James, wow, even breaks it up further. So the New King James has verses 1 to 6, and then separates out this comment about Joseph. And then, well, notice it really breaks it down. So that's not really going by scenes in the New King James. It's going by, because each dialogue. So Joseph, Potiphar's wife speaks, Joseph speaks, summary about, yeah, there's really no rhyme or reason on this one to me from New King James. I have found, Nigel, because that's a good question you ask. I have found with narratives that generally the translations don't seem to be very consistent in how they break up the narratives. ESV looks like they tried to do that, as well as the New American Standard and LSB, but I honestly don't even look at what the translators do because I have not generally found that to be helpful. I just try to look for, what I do is, the first thing I do is I look for, okay, is there a change in time or place? Change in setting. That's the first thing I look for as I go through the story. And then I'll ask, okay, there is a change in time or place here, but it's still the same situation, or is it a new situation? So that's where I'll kind of go back and forth, like I was just doing here with this story. But yeah, for paragraphs and epistles, I use the translations a lot. They're usually really helpful.
Okay.
And for stanzas in poetry, which we're going to see in the next module, the translations can be helpful.
Okay.
Not always, and we'll see why when we get there. For narratives, I just haven't really seen, I haven't been helped by the translations as far as breaking down the scenes.
Okay.
So
thank you, Pastor Tim.
yeah. And like I said, if you do the New King James, I mean, they're all over the place. The
Right.
NIV as well. So Um, but like I said, if we get skilled at just looking for that change in setting as sort of our first check, I think that's a helpful guide. Do that first, and that's probably going to get you pretty close to each of the scenes, identifying them, and then you can go back and sort of examine a little more carefully and just see that does that change in setting really indicate a new scene.
Okay.
All right.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Other questions or comments? Or even cries of despair be okay too.
I have one more, if that's fine.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
I struggle sometimes with where a scene specifically ends and the next one begins, because sometimes there are these transitionary
Yeah.
sentences. So
Yeah.
it can go either way. You mentioned earlier, right? The scene starts to darken, so it can get a
Yeah.
little tricky.
Yeah, we see that a couple times in this story. One is when, right, we talked about in verse 16, when she puts the garment at her side and waits for the master to come home.
Yes.
Could you put that in the next scene? Yeah. I think I did originally, but the more I thought about it, the more it felt to me like that was just sort of the closing statement for that scene. And then it happens again at the end of the next scene, like when Joseph is in prison. Do we include that statement he was in prison with the following scene, or is it sort of kind of the closure of the previous scene? So that's a judgment call. And like I said with diagramming, just make a decision. And you can always, as you examine the story and as you go through the scene analysis, you may end up changing your mind, and that's okay. This is not an exact process at the beginning because we're just learning the story. So it's just like with the diagram, we're not going to get a perfect diagram on the first try. It's not going to happen. And same with the scene analysis. We're not going to catch everything exactly at the beginning, but we start somewhere and we just do our best, go from there. And often what happens for me in my experience, I go through the story, and then as I'm doing scene analysis, I'm kind of like, this part of the scene really seems like it should go with the next scene. So as I get more familiar with the story, as I break down the scene and look at it more specifically, a lot of times I'll make changes as I go along. Sometimes I'll even do that when I get all the way to the sermon. So I've done all the study and I'm preparing the sermon to preach, and as we talked about in class, I encourage you to preach the sermon by the scenes. And there have been times where I'm putting the sermon together and go, you know what? I think this actually is in the wrong. It should go in the other scene. So I've even made changes at the very end, just from as I get more and more familiar with the story. So, and that's okay, right? You guys know this from your own experience in studying and preaching, that I'm sure you guys have made adjustments and changes even at the very end as you get insights. I've had times where as I'm preaching, something pops out at me like, oh, now I get this, right? I don't know if you've had that experience. Probably not. You guys are experienced, skilled preachers. But for me, I've like been in those times where I'm in the pulpit and I'm going through the text and I'm like, oh, I think I got this part wrong, and so I've even made changes in that sermon, or at times, even when I preach the same passage another time later, and I go and I kind of find things that I think weren't as clear or accurate the first time I preached it. So it's a dynamic process. We do our best. We're diligent, study, we pray, be dependent. But for whatever reason, sometimes that certain things aren't, we're not gonna nail it perfectly right from the beginning. So you guys need to be comfortable with, do your best from what you know. Trying to give you basic guidelines to kind of work with those, look for change in setting, and then just do the analysis. And then as you get more familiar with the story, do the other steps, you'll make adjustments. Just like you guys did when, you were preparing your messages from Colossians. And you had an exegetical idea, the author's main point. And then I noticed many times some of you guys, as you examined the homiletical idea, your sermon main point, you made changes. You adjusted because as you thought more about it, you realized there were certain things that you wanted to change. And that's okay. We do our best to try to have most accurate and clear understanding at the end as we preach, but even at that time, sometimes not everything's gonna be like that. But this is, the term iterative process. This is kind of like the reason why I have you do this analysis. You go through the story four different times looking for different things. So first you're looking for the setting of the story, and then now we're doing the scenes of the story, breaking those down, examining them. And then after that, we're going to do the character analysis for the story. And then we're going to do the plot analysis for the story. And so this is sort of going through the story, but looking for different aspects of the story. And by doing that, it forces us to look at the story from different points of view, and often that process will flesh out things you may not have seen. When you do the scene analysis, and then you get to say the character analysis, and so you shift a little bit, look for something different. Sometimes I didn't notice this before. Just because you're looking at the story now from a little bit different angle, with different things you're focusing on. And so this iterative process, or going through the story in several steps from different angles, looking for different things, that really helps to expose, or to help us see the story from different points of view. And I think that's what allows us to have a more accurate understanding of it when we get to the end. Okay, so a long answer to a short question, but
that's very comforting and encouraging. Thank you so much, Pastor Tim.
Narratives are hard. Got to be honest. I mean, in one sense, stories are easy, right? Easy to remember. They're fun to tell, fun to read. But really, trying to analyze it and understand what the author's point is and how he gets to that point, that's not easy. So don't feel bad if things aren't really clear or making sense sometimes as we're doing this. Perhaps you haven't looked at stories like the way we're looking at them here, but we're just trying to break down how stories work, how narratives work. And they are a plot that is understood by understanding the scenes of the story, understanding the characters within the story. And so that's why we're now looking at each of these particular elements so that we can figure out the point of the story. Okay. Other questions? All right. Thanks, Nigel. Those are helpful and good questions. All right, let's see where we're at here. So we've got the scenes identified. Now what we want to do is examine each scene and look for those. Remember those 6 elements that I described: the setting, the key characters, the narrator, key narrator statements, important dialogue, summarize the scene, and then look at the if there's anything we observe. So just like I did before, here, let me show you this. I took the sorry, let me move this over. What I did is I took the scenes. I did this in class. Let me just first kind of give you the long view here. Um, so I took the story and then colored it, where the blue highlighting is the narrator comments. The green highlights are Joseph's statements. The yellow highlights are Potiphar's wife. Now you notice something interesting here, right? Notice the story begins and ends with the narrator. And then in the middle, you know, of course, he makes some statements. And then notice Joseph only has one statement in the whole story in green there. And then yellow is, of course, Potiphar's wife. Okay, those are the only characters in the story who say anything. Now, of course, the master Potiphar's in the story, but he's not recorded saying anything. He just puts Joseph in prison. Okay. But it's really the narrator, and then Joseph has this one statement he makes, and then there's Potiphar's wife. So you can really see here that I think this story really is intended to draw us to, you know, just seeing how God's orchestrating events and leading Joseph from the pit to the throne. And these are the events that lead to his going into jail. Okay. So we want to try to do in the time that we have here is just sort of look at the scenes analysis. So I'll keep the scenes on the side here. So again, I did this in class, you know, where I used the highlighting to sort of, I highlight the different characters and what they say, and then the narrator comments, because sometimes that's just helpful for me, gives me a visual picture of who the key key statements. Kind of interesting, you know, when we talked about David and Samuel, that if you were, you know, do this highlighting scheme, you would see David doesn't speak. He's the main character, right, in Samuel, book of Samuel, but he doesn't speak until chapter 17. So like you get through, you know, 16 chapters of the book and David hasn't said a word. It's not till chapter 17 when he basically says, you know, who's going to fight this Philistine? Who's going to let him get away with mocking the armies of the living God? That's the first statement recorded in Samuel from David. So it's kind of interesting. So it can be helpful sometimes to sort of, you know, like do this visual representation of the different characters speaking in the story. You don't have to do that. It's not part of the analysis that we're required to do. It's just something that I like to do that helps me in analyzing the story. All right, so let's do this here. Okay, Normally, I'd have you guys just take time yourself and do this, but given we only have about 30 minutes left, I'd like to get through a couple of these scenes. So maybe what we can do is I'll just maybe ask questions from you guys as we go through. So let's do this. Let me increase this a little bit. Okay, so the first, we didn't really call it a theme, call it an introduction, because it's really just the narrator sort of setting up the story for us. And I put the setting as, at Potiphar's house, Joseph's about 18 to 25 years old. So it's covering a period of time as it introduces the story. Okay. And the key characters in the scene are the ones mentioned here. Who would those be, you think? So you can look over to the right of your screen. I've got the introduction there. All right. Anybody want to key characters mentioned here in these first 6 verses? Who are they?
In this part, Dr. Tim, can I clarify if we will include those without the dialogue as a key character, or we will also include even when they don't have a dialogue or they don't have a statement?
Yeah, I would just include, those individuals who normally, like you even mentioned, Stephen, this isn't really a scene per se. It's more of an introduction. So normally in the scene, you'll have the characters saying or doing something. Here, obviously, Joseph would be a central character in the introduction, right? He's mentioned several times. He's the focus. So I would mention him, even though he's not recorded as saying anything yet. You have Joseph, you have Yahweh, the Lord, right, is doing action here. The Lord was with Joseph. The Lord caused all that he did to succeed. The Lord blessed the Egyptian's house. So clearly, Yahweh is a key character in this story. And then we might even include Potiphar. Even though Potiphar doesn't really do anything here, he is mentioned several times. His master saw the Lord was with him. The master made him overseer in the house. He left Joseph in charge. So Potiphar is recorded as doing some things here. So even though there's no dialogue, these still are 3 prominent characters in this particular section. Okay. And we can really skip to like the dialogue. There's no dialogue here. Right? So only the narrator speaks. So we're only going to be focusing attention really on what seem to be key statements by the narrator in this first, since he's the only one talking. Okay. What seem to be some important comments from the narrator that we see here? Anything he repeats or anything that seems significant?
The Lord was with Joseph.
Yeah, that's a very significant. Let me see, do it this way. The Lord was with Joseph. This is something he was going to repeat later in the story, right? We see this in verse 2 and verse 3, right?
Yeah.
And then even verse 5 says the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. So that's really saying the same kind of thing. So that's definitely being emphasized here. Which, stepping back, guys, right? What's the theme of the Joseph narrative? God's sovereign hand in the life of Joseph. Boy, we see that emphasized here, don't we? 3 times. The Lord was with Joseph. Yahweh was with him. The Lord blessed all that Joseph was in charge of. So we really see that being drawn out here. Okay, anything else that seems significant in what the narrator?
Joseph found favor in his sight.
Ah, good. Yeah, verse 4. And maybe even we could say verse 5, the blessing of the Lord was on all that Potiphar had. And then two, I think, note uh, the author explicitly gives a description of Joseph's appearance in verse 6 there at the end, right? He kind of just throws this in. And we see why, right, in the verses that follow, that Potiphar's wife was attracted to him. Okay. Anything else that seems significant? I think that's good. And as we said in the dialogue, nothing really there. There's no dialogue here. So, and then if you had any kind of additional observations, I think one thing that stuck out to me when I went through this scene in particular was just I noticed the focus on Joseph's success because of Yahweh seemed to be a pretty prominent emphasis of the scene. Okay, how might we summarize this introduction? Anybody want to try to offer a summary statement? Nobody wants to try? No brave men among us? I mean, if you think about the narrator's comments, important, I think it seems to focus in on a particular theme here.
God's favor exalts Joseph in Potiphar's house.
Ah, that's good. God's favor exalts Joseph in Potiphar's house. Yeah. Yeah, and if we wanted, we could add, resulting in uh, Potiphar promoting or putting Joseph in charge. You don't have to do that, but we could add that too. But yeah, I think the main part here is definitely what Nigel said. I would see that as a good summary. Now notice, by the way, guys, when we do these summaries, we're not making it into a sermon summary. We're not going to say, we're not saying, three lessons from God's sovereignty. That's not what we're doing. In the summary, we're just focusing on the story itself, not anything that is being taught by the story. We won't look at those timeless truths or doctrinal elements till we get later on in the process. At this step, we're just trying to, okay, let's take this scene and sort of summarize it into what seems to be the focus of this scene, okay, in connection with the story. So that's what we're after here. That's the goal. Okay. Any thoughts or questions on that, on this
So I think I
particular
have a
thing?
question.
Yeah, Sonny.
Can can we also connect this to the um God's covenant with Abraham? Like in the context of the covenant with Abraham's, like starting at the patriarchal promise of Yahweh to Abraham. Can we also do the summary within that context? Like, for example, uh, God's covenant is, about to fulfill in through Joseph in the house of Potiphar's in Egypt, something like that. Because that would be also a kind of transitions to the book of Exodus. I mean, just curious if we can do that as well.
Yeah, that will come later. That's a more interpretive element as far as interpreting the point of the story or how the story is linked to the theme of the book. So that will come later. At this point in our study, we're just focused on the scene itself, not what the scene is meant to teach us as far as the plot of the story. We'll get to that when we cover the plot analysis. At this step, it's just okay. In focusing only on the story, what's described here that how could we summarize this in connection with just the story itself, not necessarily the message of the story. Does that make sense?
All right. I
Okay, but that
Thank you, sir.
definitely, what you said is a key message from the story as a whole, but that's going to come out when we get to the plot. The scene analysis is simply just breaking down the story itself as far as what happens, what took place in this story. Well, in this scene, the focus was, in this case, the focus was God gave Joseph favor in the eyes of Potiphar. Okay, that's the specific focus of this particular scene. Now, as we later look at the plot, we'll see, well, God is doing this because it's being driven by his sovereignty in Joseph's life in order to preserve, to keep the Abrahamic covenant. But that's not seen explicitly in this particular scene. Okay, but as we seek to interpret the point of the story and its connection with Genesis, really, that's when our understanding of how it links in with the Abrahamic covenant and all, that's when that would come out. Just like when we did the story with Abraham and Isaac, at the very end, God restates the covenant. So we would state that there, that scene, the summary was God affirmed Abraham's faith and reaffirmed the covenant with Abraham. But then as we did the plot of the story, we went even further to say, well, really, this story was about God being faithful to his promise to Abraham by preserving Isaac's life. So we just want to be careful at this stage for scene analysis. We're not interpreting the message of the story yet. We're just looking at the key parts of the story and carrying the story along. Okay, that was a good question. Let's try to take a look at the second scene here, or really the first scene. scene 1, the introduction, verses 1 to 6, really the introduction. Scene 1, the first scene of the story is now we are at Potiphar's house still. And this is now towards later when Joseph's maybe 25, 26 years old. The first 6 verses covers a period of time. It's a summary of how God was with Joseph and blessed Joseph and used him to be a blessing to Potiphar. So now we're zeroing in, Moses is zeroing in, focusing on a particular sequence of events that was going to take place. Notice verse 7, after a time. Okay, so verse 6 had ended, Joseph was a handsome guy. Verse 7, now after a time, so some time has passed now. We don't know how long, but it's clear that we're shifting now. The author's shifting from his introduction now to some details, events and dialogue that he wants us to pay attention to. And so I think we had identified the scene as from verses 7 to 10. Okay, so key characters in this scene. Again, you can look at
The wife.
sort of, obviously Potiphar's wife, Mrs. Potiphar. We could call her really the adulteress, right? She's clearly a key character. Anyone else? Key character in this scene?
Joseph.
Joseph. Yep. Okay. I think those are the two. Nobody else is in this scene. All right. Important narrator comments. Notice the narrator speaks right at the beginning and right at the end. He doesn't say much.
Joseph refused and he would not listen to her.
Okay. Yeah, Joseph's verse 8. Joseph's refusal to give in to her, what's the word? Seduction, I don't know. And then I would say verse 10, right? She did this day after day. So it wasn't just like one time. This was sort of a pattern now. At some point, she started lusting after Joseph and wanted to have sex with him, but he refused. And then verse 10, she did this day after day, kept going to him. Okay. Those seem to be, I think, the main statements here. Unless anybody sees something else that. Okay, important dialogue. Well, I mean, the Potiphar's wife just has the one statement here, right? Lie with me. That's all she says in this count. Then we have, of course, the main dialogue here is really Joseph's response to her. And notice, what is it that he said? What do you see in his remarks that would seem significant for this scene? Anybody?
How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good summary, right? How can I do this? And notice he says, and sin against God. So he doesn't just say that it would be wrong against my master, but this would be a sin against God as well. Okay, so really, I think we could summarize really his whole point was, right, Joseph declares could not sin against his master or God. And also too, he called it a great wickedness. Okay. Um, again, you might, anything, observations, anything that would stick out to you. I think one thing that stuck out to me was just we don't know how long this went on, right? It just says day after day. Makes it sound like it was probably uh happening for a while. We don't know how long. And then also I noticed too what stuck out, right, is when Joseph said, right, how could I sin against God? So Joseph feared the Lord and did not want to sin against him. It kind of reminds me of David's remark, didn't it? Remember what he said in Psalm 51? Against you only I have sinned and done what is evil in your sight. That passage came into my mind as I looked at what Joseph said here, that he had the same. Now David gave in, so he actually did sin against God. Here, Joseph fled the temptation because he did not want to sin against God. Unfortunately, David didn't tell himself that before what happened with Bathsheba. He learned after. That's not when you want to learn that lesson. But any case, that's just so that, again, the observations is not necessarily interpretations you're making or anything. It's just things that come to mind. So like I said, for me, Psalm 51 verse 4 came to mind. When David said, against you and you only I have sinned. All right, summary. How would we summarize this scene? Anybody want to try? And again, the summary is just sort of, we're not interpreting the message of the scene in the context of the plot. We're just looking at, okay, what seems to be the key focus of this scene in the flow of the story as to what happened.
The wife, Potiphar's wife, seduced and lusted on Joseph
All right,
for
yeah.
quite some time.
Tried to seduce Joseph many times, but then we could say, but Joseph refused.
But Joseph refused because of with his fear of God, because of his fear of God.
Yeah, something like that. We could probably shorten that down a little bit, but I think that captures the general idea. Yeah, I mean, we could maybe say something like, because of his fear of the Lord, Joseph refused Mrs. Potiphar's seduction. That would be another way to say it. Something like that. Okay? Again, just focusing on the key events of the scene. All right, I think we can squeeze in one more scene because it's pretty short here. Scene 2. Again, remember the blue represents the narrator comments. The yellow is the Potiphar's wife dialogue. No green here in this particular scene. So as we consider the setting, still at Potiphar's house, sometime after scene 1, but on the same day. Sorry, on a not the same day, on a different day. Because notice how it begins. But one day, when he went into the house to do his work. Okay. So key characters. Who do we have here?
The wife, Joseph.
Okay, we have definitely Potiphar's wife, right? She's the one who takes action. So again, Mrs. Potiphar. And then yeah, Joseph doesn't say anything, but we do have Joseph taking action, right? He leaves, he runs. Okay. So Potiphar's wife is really the main character in this scene, but Joseph is also in this scene because notice Joseph went into the house to do his work, and then she tries to seduce him again, but he runs off. Okay. Now, important narrator comments. Anything that the narrator says that seems significant here?
She called the men of her house. Yeah, as soon
Okay.
as she saw that she had a garment left in her hand, she accused.
Yeah, notice the garments repeated several times. Did you guys catch that? Verse 12. Here, I'll highlight it in gray. Caught him by his garment. He left his garment. He left his garment. He left his garment. See that? So 3 times the narrator mentions that. The 4th time it's in the dialogue from Potiphar's wife. And the garment is what ends up being a key piece of evidence against Joseph, right? He left it because she grabbed it off of him. But she made it seem like, he took it off and, he's undressing because he wanted to have sex with her. But the garment was repeated. Anything else from the narrator? Maybe verse 11. He notes that one particular day, the men were not in the house. So he had no witnesses. So now he was vulnerable in this at this point. Key dialogue. So here only Potiphar's wife speaks. Anything she says that's significant for the story. Definitely lie with me, right? Verse 12. And then verse 14, she mentions it. And again, that's what she says back up here in verse 7. Okay, so that seems to be a point of emphasis that I would note. Anything else she says?
To laugh at us? What was it? What does it mean?
Yeah, like making sport of, uh, treating as disrespecting, taking advantage of. I think it's kind of the idea. So yeah, you could put that. And notice she refers to him as this as the Hebrew. So like, hey, this low life Hebrew come in here to, disrespect us, and try to take advantage of me. Um, it's kind of the idea.
There's something I find interesting. The line "He has brought us." He there, is that referring to Potiphar?
Um, sorry, where are you at?
See, he has brought among us. The he there.
Oh, yeah. That's a good observation. Huh, I would put that under observation
Hmm. Oh,
myself.
right.
Yeah. You can put it anywhere, but so yeah, that's good. So interesting. Yeah. All right. Um, yeah, I mean, really, her dialogue is just she's, you know, spinning her story. Summary. How would we summarize this? Anybody want to make an attempt here? Any
Go, Pastor
brave
Chong.
souls among? Okay, go ahead, Stephen.
No, I'm saying I'm cheering to let Pastor Chong do it.
Oh, okay. We have a nomination of Pastor Chong to give the summary. Is there a
Why
second?
me?
There a second to the nomination? I think Alexander wants to make sure we don't choose him because he's, blocking his screen there.
Okay, I don't think I
John,
can do
give it a
this.
try.
um, I think it's a failure accusation.
Uh, yeah, she's accusing, so we'd want to include that, right? She accuses Joseph of trying to rape her. So maybe something like after Joseph flees or rejects, or I think flees from her, Potiphar's wife accuses him of trying to rape her. Something like that. I think that would be good enough. Okay. All right. Well, we don't have time to do the other two scenes in the story, but this would be kind of the idea. So what we'd end up with is summarizing each. We'd have another scene 3 and scene 4. Right. Scene 3 really was Potiphar believes his wife's story and puts Joseph in prison. And then the last scene would be similar to the first one, where Yahweh was with Joseph and giving him favor in the sight of the jailer and put in charge. It's the same it's a pattern, right? That's exactly what happened in Potiphar's house. So you could almost take the summary statement we did for verses 1 to 6 and stick it on verses 21 to 23. Again, this emphasis, notice the Lord was with Joseph, gave him favor. The Lord was with him. The Lord made him succeed. See that? It's really the same kinds of things that were said in the first scene. So you'd want to take note of that. Okay? So here, all we're really doing, honestly, guys, the scene analysis is just getting us familiar with, just helping us to get more familiar with the story and the key parts of the story and preparing us to look at the plot of the story. So all we're doing with the scene analysis is just trying to determine, follow the key events or key situations in the story. Okay. Again, we're not interpreting the message of the story yet. We're not at that point. This is one of those preparation steps that will help us in examining the plot of the story, which is what will show us the point of the story. And that comes a little bit later. Okay. And so now when we do for assignment 211, which is the setting and scene analysis of your passage from Ruth or Jonah, you're going to do the setting for the book. So if you have a passage from, Ruth chapter 2, you're going to do the setting for the book of Ruth and then break down the scenes for the chapter that you're assigned. So for example, Stephen, what was your assigned chapter?
Ruth 1.
Ruth 1. So you'll do the setting for the book of Ruth, and then you'll do the scene analysis for Ruth chapter 1. Okay. Or if someone has Jonah 3, you'll do the setting for the book of Jonah, and then do the scenes for Jonah chapter 3. Now, if you want, I would recommend this, do the scene for the whole book. That will take you longer, but I think that'll really, really help you to understand and see how your assigned passage fits the book. Okay. But if you just do the scenes
The instruction there, Dr. Tim, is the whole book.
Yeah. Yeah,
The
setting
instruction,
sorry?
the instruction given to the assignment was the whole book will give a scene analysis.
Let me see. Yeah, someone asked me this, and I don't know if I answered it correctly. So let me pull up the assignment real quick.
Yeah, actually on the scene part, it's only on the instruction is only on the assigned passage, but on the setting part, it's for the whole book.
Yeah, I think I I think there was a mistake in the Canvas instructions. But in the assignment instructions, okay, we have the setting analysis, which we covered last time. All right. And then I showed an example. And then the scene analysis, again, we talked about the procedure. So then when we get to, and then I gave an example from Genesis 22. And then the assignment, I said, carry out the setting analysis for the entire book of the passage you've been assigned. So again, that when you do the setting analysis, you're doing it for the whole book, Ruth or Jonah. But the scene analysis, just do the scene analysis for your assigned passage. Now,
Yeah.
so sorry. Yeah, I think that's Stephen, you pointed that out. Now, I think, let me take a look, but I think there was a mistake on the Canvas that I need, because somebody pointed this out to me. Let me just pull that up real quick. Okay, so here's, okay, assignment 211. Oh, no, so that's, okay. So yeah, just follow the instructions. So this just says complete this setting and scene for Ruth or Jonah. And you only do it for the book you're assigned. But if you look at the assignment instructions, it says scene analysis just for your assigned passage. Okay. Now, I think a couple of you did it for the book. I would recommend you do it for the book, but I'll only grade you for doing it for your assigned passage. If you did do it for the whole book, I will give you extra credit. All right. So,
Dr. Tim, can I ask a question
yeah.
on the first part on the setting analysis? Because on the example, the setting analysis here is, yeah, it's a different setting analysis from what we did.
Sorry,
So
talking
it has
about,
observation. Yeah, I'm talking about the setting analysis. So are we to do what is given on the example in, yeah, assignment 211, or are we to do the where and when
no, do
part?
the setting. Notice here, the setting analysis procedure is read through the book several times and make observations. So do
Yeah.
that step. And then you'll note the
But we will,
physical, temporal, cultural aspects of the story. What is your question?
yeah, because so we don't need to do the scene, example scene one and then where and when. I think I see that also named as setting analysis. So I'm a bit confused because this setting analysis is for the whole book. And then there's also the setting
Yes.
analysis part within the scene.
Yes. Yeah, those are different. The setting of the book is you're looking at the book as a whole. So it could cover
Yeah.
a longer period of time. Now, so like for Ruth, the setting of the book goes from, right, it starts with the famine and then goes for 10 years. So it's in the time of the judges. That's the general time period. It's specifically, in a period in the time of the judges, it covers about 11 or 12 years, right? Because there's the 10 years that they're in Moab, and then they come back and their time in Jerusalem. Then Ruth gets pregnant, has a baby. All right. So the time period covers about, 11 or 12 years within the time of the judges. Okay. Now, if you're in Ruth chapter 2, you're not in the 10-year period. You're in, the latter part of that, the 11th year, so to speak, of the story. So the setting of Ruth chapter 2 will just be, it'll be just in Bethlehem during like the 11th year. But if the story as a whole covers Moab and Bethlehem, and it covers, a 12-year time span. You see the difference? So the setting of the story of the book is going to be a little bit broader than your specific story. Like Genesis 39. The book of Genesis, the setting is quite broad, right? It goes from the beginning of time all the way to the life of Jacob. But in Genesis 39, we're just in, a 7 or 8 year period of Joseph's life. And we're just in Potiphar's house and in the jail. So the setting of that story is going to be very specific and narrow. The setting of the book is going to be a little bit broader. It's going to include more locations and more time. So when you do the setting analysis, you're doing it for the whole book. When you do the scene analysis, you're just going to do the setting for each scene of your story. Does that help? Yeah, sorry if that's confusing.
Yes.
Okay.
So what I did, Pastor Tim, is I just followed the A to E steps without the breakdown, without the setting analysis of each of the scene. Correct?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay.
Yeah, because when you get to the scene analysis, which we do here, each scene has its own setting within the story.
Yes.
This is not
Correct.
the whole book. So yeah, like I said, if you're in Jonah chapter 3, you're not dealing with the sailors, that part of the story. Okay, that's part of the whole book. The setting is going to include, Jonah in Israel, and then he tries to leave, and then he ends up in Nineveh. So the setting of the book's going to have some different locations, but the setting of chapter 3 in Jonah is just going to be Nineveh. Right after the 3 days in the fish, and then the journey he had to take, which would have taken him a couple of months probably, from Israel to Babylon or to Nineveh. So Jonah 3, he's in Nineveh. So the setting of that story is just going to be in Nineveh over the course of 40 days, right? Because it says 40 days, or sorry, not 40 days, and over the course of 1 day. Jonah walks through the city, just 1 day's journey, it says. So the setting of Jonah 3 is just going to be that narrow part. And then each scene will be like, I think the one scene is Jonah arrives in Nineveh and preaches through Nineveh. And the second scene is, in the throne room of the king of Nineveh. But for the setting analysis, you're doing it for the book. So it's going to have Nineveh. It's going to have Jonah on the ship, Jonah in the fish. So it's basically Jonah on top of the Mediterranean, and then in the Mediterranean, as locations, and then in Nineveh, and then outside of Nineveh. And then the time period will be over the course of a few months, because it would take Jonah a couple months to get from Israel to Nineveh. All right. And then, like I said, Ruth would be over the course of like 12 years for the whole book. But if you're in a particular chapter, like Ruth chapter 4, it's going to be about a year. transpires, right? Because you have the Boaz commits to marrying Ruth. He marries Ruth. They have a child. So that's going to be about a year of time. And the location is in Jerusalem or Bethlehem. All right. Now, each scene in there's a few scenes in chapter 4 that are going to be at a different time and location within the story of chapter 4. Okay. And like I said, I think some of you may have done the scene analysis for the whole book. You don't have to do that for the assignment, but if you did, I would recommend doing that. I did that, and it really helped me. But I didn't require you to do that on the assignment. Just do the chapter you're assigned. But if you do the book, I'll give you, an extra 10 or 15% bonus for the effort. But it will benefit you to do the book. And honestly, if you look at Ruth and Jonah, I mean, there's only, like, Jonah has what, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 or 8 scenes in the whole book. Ruth would be about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, maybe 8 or 9 scenes in the whole book. So something like that. But yeah, it will take a little longer, but I think you will find it to be profitable, but not required. Again, just do the chapter. That's what's required for the scene analysis. Okay, well, I've gone over time-wise, but any questions about that? Hopefully that makes sense. And technically the assignment was due last week, but since we didn't cover it, till today, it's okay if to turn that in a little bit late. I understand. It's not a problem. Just don't get too far behind. But then, yeah, next week, I'll try to cover the character analysis, maybe the plot analysis. I'll see how time permits. Probably be able to do both. And then I think we'll be caught up there. But then after that, I'm going to be, like I said, in Turkey and in Pakistan, month of July. So we'll meet once. I'll have one more meeting next week, I think. I'll at least record something if I'm not able to do a live meeting. I'll let you know, and then we'll be off for till the beginning of August, and then meet all through August, Lord willing. Okay. All right. Well, I can hear some of your stomachs growling, so I know it's lunchtime for you guys. So I'll let you go. I'm going to ask if Brother Sonny, if you could close us in prayer.
Right, let's pray.